My parents told a big lie and took my $155,000 wedding savings to pay for my siblings' honeymoon. So I decided to marry secretly and leave them broke. Hey there, I recently tied the knot with my partner after being together for 6 years. Instead of the big beach wedding I dreamed of, we had a small ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse. I love the beach because it's where we have many happy memories. We used to go there often to relax and have fun. I had been saving for 5 years for a big wedding celebration, just like any other bride. I work in advertising and earn a good salary. My husband and I used to live simply and save for the future. We wanted to book one of the top hotels with an ocean view for our wedding guests to enjoy a luxurious experience. However, we had to downsize our plans because my parents borrowed money from me a few months ago, and I couldn't refuse. I have a job in advertising that pays well, but my husband and I have always lived simply and saved money. We were planning to book a top-notch hotel with an ocean view for our wedding, aiming for a luxurious experience for our guests. Unfortunately, we had to change our plans and settle for something more modest because my parents borrowed money from me a few months back, and I couldn't refuse. Got it, thanks for the context. Here's a rewritten version of that part. My younger brother, 24 meters, recently tied the knot in a hastily arranged ceremony. He'd been dating his now wife for about 2 years and proposed just a month before the wedding. It was a small affair with only close family and a handful of friends. I was happy for him. After all, it was their special day and their choice. However, a few weeks later, my mother contacted me with an urgent request. She needed to borrow $115,000, claiming my father had suddenly fallen ill. She attributed it to his diabetes, stating they couldn't afford his medical expenses alone, especially a special imported medication not covered by their insurance. Concerned for my father's health, I didn't hesitate to lend the money, trusting her explanation. I visited him a couple of times and repeatedly asked my mother to show me the medical reports, but she always found a way to dodge those requests. Whenever I saw my dad, he was in bed, yet he didn't seem very ill. I questioned why he hadn't been hospitalized for proper care, but my mother insisted it wasn't necessary for the time being. Still, they claimed he needed an expensive, uncommon drug not covered by insurance. I wasn't naive. After a few visits, I sensed something was off with my parents, but I hesitated to accuse them without concrete evidence. Accusing them of lying about a medical emergency to borrow money would reflect poorly on me if it turned out to be true. I noticed my brother hadn't been visiting our parents. When I asked why, my father said they didn't want to worry him, wanting him to focus on work. Yet, they seemed unconcerned about my worry. After a couple of weeks, I called my brother and learned he hadn't visited because he was on his honeymoon. I was surprised since I hadn't known he left, as neither my parents nor he and his wife posted about it on social media. I was left wondering where he was. When I questioned him about why he hadn't informed me, he explained he wanted to surprise everyone by returning after a month with tales and photos from their European trip. He admitted he hadn't planned to tell me at all but felt compelled to respond when I mentioned our father's illness. He reassured me he had spoken to our parents after my concerned message, and they assured him they were fine. He speculated they might have exaggerated the situation, attributing my belief to my tendency to worry excessively, leading to a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt, thinking perhaps they kept the truth from my brother to avoid spoiling his honeymoon or causing unnecessary worry. Yet I couldn't shake what I had witnessed at their house. There was no room for misunderstanding. However, when my brother revealed our parents funded his lavish honeymoon, I became suspicious. It raised red flags in my mind. So I asked him how much their extravagant trip would cost, and he revealed it would set our parents back at least $125,000. They were sparing no expense, staying at top-notch hotels, dining at the finest restaurants, and splurging on shopping. They justified it as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It dawned on me that this was where my money was going. There was no medical emergency at all. They never had any documentation or hospital visits to prove otherwise. My parents concocted the story to finance my brother's honeymoon, intending it as their wedding gift. I felt deeply betrayed as my brother boasted about our parents going all out to ensure his honeymoon was spectacular since they missed out on a lavish wedding. The money I lent them, meant for my own wedding, now seemed like a betrayal when I realized it funded my brother's trip. Confronting my parents, they confessed they fabricated the medical emergency to ensure I'd lend them the money, knowing I wouldn't if I knew it was for my brother's honeymoon. They justified it by explaining my brother's work struggles and desire for a worry-free break. They couldn't fund it themselves without jeopardizing their retirement, so they turned to me, reasoning that I had time to earn it back, unlike them. They insisted it was just money and promised to repay it eventually, but for now, they urged me to prioritize my brother's happiness. They claimed his rejuvenation from the honeymoon prevented him from sinking into depression. I couldn't believe it. Sacrificing my wedding plans for this was unacceptable. While I was initially willing to scale back the wedding to ensure my father's health, funding my brother's honeymoon was not part of the agreement. Furious at their deception, I demanded repayment before my own wedding as I intended to use that money for my special day. I had a lot to consider regarding expenses for my beach wedding. While my husband's family was helping out, I needed to ensure my own financial security. My parents had made it clear early on that they could support either my education or my wedding, not both. Opting for college, I had planned to fund my wedding independently, hence my savings. Curious about my brother's experience, I asked if he faced the same choice. His dismissive response made it evident that our parents treated us differently, though I never confronted them about it, unwilling to accuse them of favoritism, despite the obvious discrepancy. But being young and reliant on their support, I didn't bring up these disparities, fearing it would worsen my situation. It wasn't until years later, during a confrontation about the money they took and their favoritism, that the issue resurfaced. Despite their denial, the favoritism was glaringly obvious. I insisted they repay me, unwilling to sacrifice my dream wedding for my brother's struggles. I had saved diligently for 5 years for this moment, only for them to snatch it away for his benefit. They claimed they couldn't repay it all before the wedding, expecting me to accept a gradual repayment over a couple of years because, in their eyes, nothing mattered more than family. If I was willing to use that money for a supposed medical emergency, then there was no reason why I couldn't allocate it to prevent my brother from feeling down about work. Here's the truth. My brother was unlikely to sink into depression over his job. He never took it seriously and performed poorly, resulting in low earnings. Working in sales, his income was mostly commission-based, so his lack of success was solely his responsibility. While he may have been a bit disappointed, he was never at risk of depression. He simply lacked motivation because he'd been spoiled by our parents and wasn't accustomed to hard work. Their exaggeration of his job dissatisfaction was simply to paint a picture of him needing rescue, which was far from the truth. I emphasized to my parents how crucial this wedding was to me. Commitments had already been made to cover certain expenses, which would become impossible without the money they took. They needed to find a solution. However, they insisted they couldn't repay me before the wedding, leaving me with no choice but to scale down or seek help from my husband's family. It reached a point where I found myself pleading with them to return my money. My parents lied about a medical emergency to steal my $155,000 wedding fund to fund my brother's honeymoon. So I married in secret and bankrupted them. Hey, so I, 26F, recently got married to my husband, 26 meters, after a 6-year-long relationship. We had an intimate ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which is not what we had in mind initially at all. I had actually wanted to get married on the beach because that's where some of our happiest memories are. My husband and I are both water babies and would make a trip to the beach at least once a month to unwind and let loose. So it's a special place for us. I had even started looking for hotels where we could all stay. Like literally any other bride on this planet, I wanted my wedding to be special, and I had even been saving money to have a huge celebration for the last 5 years. I work in advertising and I get paid decently, but my husband and I used to live modestly and tried our best to save money for the future. We had been planning to book one of the best hotels with a sea-facing view so our guests could really have a fantastic time, and it was meant to be a luxurious experience. But we had to change our plans and scale down considerably because my parents decided to borrow money from me a couple of months ago, and I couldn't bring myself to decline. Some context here, my brother, 24 meters, also got married a couple of months ago, but it had been sudden for him, and they didn't plan much. He had been with his wife for about 2 years, and he had proposed to her just a month before they got married. It was a really small ceremony with just family and a few friends, but I was happy for him since it was their wedding, their choice. But a few weeks after the wedding, my mother reached out to me and asked to borrow $115,000. She told me that my father had fallen ill all of a sudden and said that it was probably his diabetes that was acting up again, but she couldn't bear all the medical expenses by herself, and she needed me to help her. She told me that there was a special drug that the doctors had suggested, but it cost a lot of money since it had to be imported, and she couldn't afford it because their insurance didn't cover this. I was really concerned for my father's health, so I decided to step up and lend her the money, no questions asked. I paid him a couple of visits and asked my mother to show me the medical reports several times, but she always managed to evade those questions. Whenever I would visit them, my dad was always in bed, but for some reason he just didn't appear very sick. Even when I asked my mother why he hadn't been moved to the hospital so he could be observed and kept under professional care, she told me that it wasn't necessary at the moment. But somehow, he was sick enough to need to be administered an uncommon drug that they didn't produce here, and it wasn't even covered by their insurance. I'm not an idiot. After the first few visits, I had figured out that something very fishy was going on with my parents, but I didn't want to accuse them of anything before I was sure. It would be a really bad look for me if I accused them of lying to me about a medical emergency just to borrow money, and then it all turned out to be true after all. I realized that my brother hadn't been visiting our parents, and even when I would ask them why he wasn't there, my father would tell me that they didn't want him to worry because he was just so young, and they wanted him to be focused on his work. And yet they were fine with me being worried sick about them. I did speak to my brother about it on a phone call after a couple of weeks had passed, and he still hadn't visited our father. He told me that he would drop by as soon as he came back from his honeymoon. That was news to me because I had no idea that he had already left for his honeymoon because my parents hadn't told me, and neither he nor his wife had posted about this on their social media either. So I had no clue where he was. When I asked him why he hadn't told me, he said that he had been planning to surprise everybody by coming back after a month of being MIA with a bunch of photos, stories, and memories from their trip around Europe. He said that he had no intention of telling me either, but he had been quite concerned when I said that our father was sick, which is why he found it necessary to reply to me. He told me that he had spoken to our parents after he received my alarming text, but they had told him that he had nothing to worry about and they were doing just fine here. He told me that our parents had probably just exaggerated the situation while talking to me, and I had believed it because I was kind of neurotic, which had led to a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt by forcing myself to believe that maybe they had been hiding the truth from my brother because they didn't want to ruin his honeymoon or get him all worried about them. Because I knew what I had seen at my parents' house and there had been no scope for a misunderstanding. But then my brother mentioned to me that he would have felt really guilty about not being there for Dad if what I had said about him being very sick turned out to be true. Because apparently our parents were the ones funding his insanely expensive and long honeymoon. All the warning bells started going off in my head. So I asked him exactly how much this trip was going to cost him, and then he told me that this trip was going to cost our parents at least $125,000 because he and his wife were pulling out all the stops and really making the most of their honeymoon by living in the most expensive hotels and eating at the best restaurants. Because they can only do this once, they would also be shopping for a lot of stuff, and even that was going to be covered by our parents. I knew instantly that this was where my money was going, and there was no medical emergency at all. There never had been any emergency to speak of, and that's why they had no documents to show me and had never even been at the hospital. My parents had just invented that whole story because they wanted the money to fund my brother's honeymoon, and that was supposed to be their wedding gift. I felt extremely betrayed while hearing my brother brag about how our parents were going above and beyond for him just so the two of them could enjoy their honeymoon since they hadn't been able to have a grand wedding. The money that I had lent to my parents was from my wedding fund, and I felt like I had been stabbed in the back when I realized that my parents had given it all away to my brother. When I confronted them after that phone call, my parents told me that they had to cook up some story because they knew that I wouldn't give them the money if I knew that this was going to be used by my brother for his honeymoon. They told me that he had been struggling at work and had been down in the dumps for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without having to worry about money. Unfortunately, they couldn't fund it themselves because that would endanger their own retirement fund, and so they had to borrow money from me. Their reasoning was that I was still young and earning and had a lot of years ahead of me where I could work and earn this money back. But it was not the same for them. They also said that it was just money and they would return it at some point, but for now I just needed to put myself second and think about my brother's feelings because this honeymoon had apparently rejuvenated him and rescued him from getting depressed. I couldn't believe it because this meant that I would have to cut down on my wedding expenses for no reason. Just to be clear, I had been okay with the idea of having a smaller wedding as long as it meant that my father's health wouldn't suffer, but this was not something that I had signed up for. I was furious once they told me the truth, and I told them that they had to pay me back before I got married because I wanted to use this money for my wedding. I had a lot of expenses to think of if I wanted to go through with a beach wedding, and even though my husband and his family were covering some of the expenses, I had to look out for myself as well. My parents paying for the wedding had never been on the card since they had told me very early on that they could either pay for me to go to college or they could pay for when I got married, but they couldn't for both. I had decided that I was going to college and would pay for my wedding on my own, which is why I had been saving up for my wedding myself. In case any of you guys are wondering, when my brother started college, I did ask him if my parents had made him choose between these two as well, and he had laughed in my face as if this was the most ridiculous idea ever. I never brought that up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favorite even though it was very clear that they did have one. But I was young and I still needed their help because I hadn't found a job at the time, so bringing these things up and fighting with them over it would only make the situation worse for me, and it didn't make sense to confront them about it. But it did come up several years later when I confronted them about the money that they had taken from me and how they had always favored my brother over me. They tried to deny it, but it was as clear as day. and I told them that they had to pay me back because I wasn't going to give up my dream wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My parents could mollycoddle him by sending him off on an expensive vacation with their own money, but I hadn't worked super hard for 5 years and saved up for my wedding just so they could snatch that amount away from me and hand it to my brother. But they told me that they couldn't return the money to me in one go before the wedding, and it would take them a couple of years to give all of it back to me. And they actually expected me to be okay with it because apparently there was nothing more important than family. If I was ready to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, then there was no reason why I couldn't spend that money to prevent my brother from slipping into depression. Here's the thing though, my brother was never going to get depressed because of work. And that's because he never took his job seriously, which is why he was bad at it and was earning so little. He works in sales and his income is almost all commission, so if he is bad at what he does, then he has nobody to blame but himself. And he might have been a little upset about that, but I can guarantee it to you guys that he was never going to get depressed. He just didn't care enough about anything because he had been spoiled by my parents all his life and just wasn't used to working hard for stuff, which is why he seemed upset about his job. That was all that it was, but my parents blew it out of proportion to make it seem like he was actually bothered by his failures at work and he had to be rescued. It was all a lot of baloney. And I tried to tell my parents that this wedding was really important to me. They already made a commitment to my husband and his family that I was going to cover certain expenses, which would become impossible if I didn't have the money. So they needed to do something, but they told me that there was no way that they could return the money to me before I got married, and I would just have to scale down or ask my husband and his family to help out. It got to a point where I actually found myself begging them to return my money to me,